Hi, I'm the Space Quest historian. Look, I'm just going to tell you right off the bat, this is going to be a bit of a strange video, honestly, and not just because of all the spooky shenanigans that go on in this game. If I were to pretend to have any sort of impartiality about this game, I'd be flat out lying, because the truth is, I'm actually good friends with the developers. The lads at Cloak and Dagger Games, Sean Etchison and John Inch, are a cagey bunch of guys, but I've somehow managed to worm myself into their good graces ever since I played their first game, a little freeware game called Muttlarks, which, for a passion project they slapped together in AGS and gave away for free, was honestly pretty impressive. I even did a full playthrough of the game with Iavonics a long time ago, and it's still a pretty fun experience, as janky as it may look at the outset. I've even had the good fortune of hanging out with them on a few occasions, starting at Adventure X in 2016, when I was shooting some B-roll and a voice behind me suddenly said,
"It's time for you to come and meet Sean Etchison."
It turns out it was John, but I've never been so freaked out at an introduction before. Earlier that year, I even did an Adventure Jam project with Sean, where we'd take photographs of our surroundings, him in England and me in Denmark, and try to cobble together a game in 2 weeks from whatever photos we sent to each other. He made a game called Erinde, based on my photos, and I made a pretty shitty game called Were We Ever, based on his. So technically, I once made a game with Cloak and Dagger Games. Now, all this distasteful bragging is just to say that, yeah, I'm biased as fuck, so you're not gonna get an impartial review out of me on this game. Anyway, since their audacious debut in the muck, they've been steadily cranking out increasingly more impressive games, including A Date in the Park and The Legend of Hand, which showed them steadily improving their craft. Up until Hobbs Barrow, they've been releasing their games independently, but with Hobbs Barrow, they managed to land a publishing deal with Wadget Eye Games, and it's fair to say that it went on to do rather well for them. The game has been nearly universally praised for its story, its creepy graphics, and its quietly unsettling atmosphere. But is it a horror game? Well, the lads themselves certainly describe it as one. Folk horror, to be precise, a subgenre of horror that typically involves an outsider who travels to a remote location and finds themselves tangling with local superstitions, often of a supernatural nature, and typically wind up dead by the end. There may or may not be bees. The game is set in the Victorian age in England, and you play as Thomasina Bateman, a plucky young tomb spelunker with some serious daddy issues. She'll balk at the notion of being described as a grave robber because her job isn't to steal shit and murder scores of indigenous wildlife like some other grave robbing protagonists we could mention, but rather to excavate and recover artifacts of archaeological interest, specifically barrows, which are ancient above-ground burial sites that, apart from the prerequisite dead people, usually contain pottery, more pottery, perhaps some trinkets of interest to the sort of people who go while stroking their silvery beards in their private libraries, and more pottery. The titular Hobbs Barrow is located in the remote village of Bewlay, and it's got Thomasina all primed and pumped because nothing makes a girl slosh her petticoat like a mound of dirt and some pottery shards. Of course, the site is the source of rampant village superstition, and this might be a good time to pull up ye olde spoiler warning, because from this point on, I'm gonna spoil the shit out of the story. If you want to unravel this mystery for yourself, then do yourself a favor and go and play the game for yourself. Yourself. It's a good game, it's not too difficult, it has a slow burn and a rewarding reveal at the end, and you can thank me later, so there's your spoiler warning, kids. Because people love making shit up to explain things they don't understand, the villagers decided to blame a period of famine on a goblin they believed lived in the barrow because, why not? So they did a little dance, made a little love, and did a binding spell on the little fucker, which fortuitously coincided with the next harvest being all ripe and bountiful. So that's all the evidence you need right there, of course. Fucking goblins, am I right? Predictably, the townsfolk are none too keen about this posh Londoner showing up and wanting to stick her trowel where it doesn't belong, and to compound matters, the doddering old prick who told her to hop on a train and come here in the first place, the elusive Mr. Leonard Shoulder, is nowhere to be found, and remains so until about 3/4 of the way through the game. Once Thomasina is finally given permission to get busy with the digging, she's already up to her elbows in life-altering revelations, including that her father was one of the 3 members of the expedition that went into the barrow to tangle with the goblin back when Thomasina was still a wee lass, which left him in a sort of waking coma where he's unable to move or speak. The other 2 were a dude who came back missing a hand and hung himself not long after, and the aforementioned Mr. Shoulder himself. Turns out that the old dude, along with a snooty-faced rat-faced gimp named Lord Panswick, who owns most of the surrounding land, are convinced that the Barrow contains more than just a wee little goblin who likes pissing off farmers, but an ancient malevolent deity which was the real target of the binding spell. In the hopes of freeing said deity from its magical prison, they've invited Thomasina under false pretenses in an attempt to persuade her to go into the Barrow and unleash pure evil. And despite countless warnings from nearly everybody in town, she goes and does it anyway. That's one way to impress your dad, sure, but whoa! Okay, yeah, I forgot to mention, the evil deity possesses her at the end and makes her kill her still comatose dad with a potted vase. So there's your dramatic irony, ladies and gentlemen. 10 out of 10 for good vibes. It does give her amazing Akira powers, though, so everything has a silver lining, I guess. Go on, do it again. There's a good girl. Now, the excavation of Hobbs Barrow is a slow burn, as befits the genre of folk horror, but it does veer off significantly into more of a Lovecraftian yarn at the end, particularly because we don't actually see the big bad demon at the end. We just see Thomasina looking gobsmacked at some hideous gargantuan shadow looming over her. Now, you could argue that this is a bit of a shift in tone that betrays its premise, and I'd be inclined to agree with that actually, but to the Cloak and Dagger lads' credit, they ease you into this change in tone with care instead of just yanking the rug out from under you, so it doesn't come across as a clash of disparate influences, but more of a mashup, which actually works pretty well in my opinion. Arguably the least successful element of this tale is, surprisingly, Thomasina herself, who spends the vast majority being an unflammable skeptic who dismisses any mention of the supernatural as
hogwash. Hogwash.
And just one more for good measure.
Hogwash. All of it.
Cheers. But by the end, she suddenly does a 180 and is like, yeah, blood ritual, let's fucking do this. She's even told point blank that Lord Twatstick and Sir Waddle Muppet here are evil and scheming against her by a drunk in the alley who overheard their conversation about luring her to town and feeding her to their evil pet demon. But in the next morning she's all like, okay, let's get the show rolling, while the players clutching their hair and shouting at the screen for her to get her head out of her ass. Apparently this flashback scene of the drunk guy overhearing these two dipshits' evil master plan was added late in development because testers were confused as to what was going on, and to that I say, what the fuck were you guys smoking? Have you ever seen a horror movie before? It's always the guy you least expect who turns out to be the twist at the end villain. And this dude doesn't even qualify as the least likely villain because he has skeevy vibes coming out of every wrinkle. I mean, just fucking look at him. Look at him. I wouldn't trust this crotchety old cunt any further than I can fling his geriatric ass. And this Lord Panswick here, whose name incidentally sounds like a British homophobic slur, couldn't be telegraphed more clearly as an obvious villain if he had glowing red eyes and a row of impaled infants on spikes lining his driveway. Not only does he launch unprompted into a Bond villain-esque monologue that all but blunts you over the head with how evil he is, but he's also the dude who shows up to tell the drunk guy who just unceremoniously dumped the whole plot twist on you via flashback to fuck off and keep his trap shut. Fans have even gone so far as to speculate that this flashback scene happens outside of Thomasina's purview, so to speak, that we momentarily shift perspective from Thomasina's point of view to that of the drunk dude, and that Thomasina never actually gets to hear any of this before Lord Pisshead here shows up to shoo him away. Which is total bullshit, because first of all, why would you pick this moment of all places to suddenly switch narrative point of view to a side character when everything else in the narrative is viewed squarely through the lens of our protagonist? And second, and most important of all, why even have this scene at all? It serves no purpose other than to prematurely whack you over the head with information that you were gonna figure out in due time anyway, and it once again leads me to suspect that the testers that lobbied for its inclusion haven't the faintest idea of how pacing in horror stories are supposed to work. Not only is this flashback scene a wet blanket over the otherwise carefully constructed smoldering embers of the expertly paced mystery plot, but it also manages to henceforth paint the protagonist as an unforgivably dense bint, who, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, decides that the best course of action is to just go ahead and proceed unperturbed to act as a human alarm clock to a malignant force of unimaginable evil. Once you get into the Barrow and start poking around, it doesn't take more than 5 minutes before Thomasina starts tripping balls, and every scene from here on to the ending is bathed in this otherworldly purplish glow that honestly gave me CGA vibes, which, as you all know, I am all for. The final section of the game has you do a series of logic puzzles in the tomb where the clues are derived from your father's old journal, and while the logic puzzles themselves are quite well done, except for this one which seems to expect you to know the Greek alphabet by heart, the whole thing gave off some strong Fate of Atlantis vibes, especially the circular disc puzzle that for all intents and purposes is just the sunstone and moonstone bullshit all over again. Anyway, once you get past the cerebral cockblocks of the lobby area here, Thomasina descends into the impossibly large inner sanctum of the tomb where you'd expect to find one last mother of a puzzle to cap off the surreal gauntlet, but instead the game just yoinks away control from you and engages autopilot, which was honestly a bit of a letdown. The last puzzle of the game is literally just pick up vase, smash dad overhead with vase, and it feels like a missed opportunity to give the player some sort of final sense of accomplishment before the otherwise brilliantly dour and depressing ending, which, let me be clear here, was a fantastic ending. I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm honestly also kind of disappointed that the devs seem to have discounted the prevalent fan theory that all of this endgame monkeying about with glowing statues and ghost cats is all in Thomasina's head as a result of overexposure to these purple flowers, which are described as hellebore plants. The spores of these plants can indeed induce hallucinations, and there's actually a precedent of them acting in such a way earlier in the game when you come across this dude who's tied up in the middle of the road with a bunch of these flowers stuck in his mouth, and after you yank his ass off the branches, he claims he never saw his assailants and has no memory of how he got strung up in the first place, so it's a safe assumption that he just got dosed with a heavy batch of trippy spores. But according to the dev commentary, which you can enable during gameplay, the intention was actually to portray the events in the Barrow as being proper supernatural stuff, which I honestly think is a bit of a letdown. At least if they'd left it ambiguous, it would have left the player with an extra layer of uncertainty at the end. Maybe Thomasina just went bonkers from a massive drug overdose in the Barrow and imagined all this shit with the demon and then went out to snuff dear old daddy under the assumption that she was doing the demon's bidding. That would have made the ending even more tragic than it already is, and good lord, if we're already gonna go with a downer ending, we might as well just pull out all the stops. Anyway, once again, I played this game on the Nintendo Switch. Yes, my new mission in life is apparently to milk Nintendo's online store dry of all point-and-click adventure games, and I was a bit worried about how a game like Hobbs Barrow, which was developed in Adventure Games Studio, would be to play on the Switch. And for those of you who don't know, one of the major drawbacks of AGS is that its cross-platform compatibility sucks. AGS was developed on decades of legacy code. The first iteration of AGS was for the DOS platform back in 1997, and as a result, the engine is still very much dependent on Microsoft-based technology. The games it spits out, even in their completed forms, are really only intended to be played on a Windows platform, and developers have to jump through a significant amount of headache-inducing hoops to get their games running on any other platform. I'm happy to say then that Wadget did an absolutely stellar job of porting this game to the Switch. You basically still have a mouse pointer that's controlled by the analog sticks, but it's nowhere near as unintuitive as that may sound. The cursor is fast and responsive, unlike some other games we could mention, and since the game uses the Wadget traditional two-button interface, left-click to interact, right-click to examine, this translates very well into an easy-to-use interface for a controller. The puzzles in Hobbs Barrow don't require you to be fast on the input either. Most of the time you have all the time in the world to position your cursor over whatever it is you want to interact with, save for one instance where you're meant to distract a character and perform the old switcheroo within a time limit. This one's a little tricky because the hotspot you need to interact with is very small, so it's a bit finicky, but the timer is mercifully lenient enough that it's not a major hassle, it's just a minor inconvenience. I still kinda wish I could move Thomasina around with one of the analog sticks and use the other one for pointing the mouse cursor around, since there is a fair bit of walking involved, but it honestly wouldn't be necessary since not only can you double tap on exit hotspots to quickly exit screens, but there's also a fast travel map available which cuts down on virtual shoe leather quite significantly. Also, props to the developers for including the option to manually advance the dialogue. I always prefer this option because it eliminates the risk of accidentally skipping dialogue lines, something I am very prone to do, even in a game that has a voice cast as stellar as this game. And okay, I'm gonna go off on a bit of a tangent here, but bear with me. The trouble with having sprites just standing around and talking to each other, which is something every 2D point-and-click adventure game has, is that you end up reading ahead of the spoken dialogue because nothing else is happening on screen. More often than not, you've already finished reading a line by the time the voice actor is halfway through it, and the temptation to skip just to get to the next line can be overwhelmingly strong because, you just want to get moving. It's something I know Wadget Eye Grand Poobah Dave Gilbert is very cognizant of, and it's why his games usually have very short lines so the player isn't tempted to skip ahead. The Cloak and Dagger lads have a very similar approach to keeping it short and sweet in this game, but even so, when an actor takes their sweet time reading through a line, pausing for inflections, and generally wringing every thespian aspiration they have out of their performance, then you know damn well I'm gonna reach for that skip button. I'm not saying that every voice actor should rush through their lines like they're late for a bus, I'm just saying, look, I have the subtitles on. If you're still on the third syllable by the time I'm done reading your line, your performance better be fucking compelling. I only have so many fucks to give. Now, the problem with having your finger hovering over the skip button is, of course, that your patience may run out just as the actor is finishing up their line, and human reaction times being what they are, you may find yourself accidentally skipping the next line before you have a chance to read it. So, this is all a long-winded way of saying that not only do the voice actors of Hotspot actually do a very good job, save for a few verbal slowpokes, the lines are also short enough that my patience remained intact for most of them, and even when it didn't, I wasn't concerned about accidentally missing out on dialogue if I did choose to skip ahead. It also helps that all the characters have these endearing English countryside accents, which I'm a sucker for. Although the voice of the goblin himself, who shows up in a couple of dream sequences, sounds a bit out of place. It's kind of hard to take an ethereal being with magical powers seriously when he sounds like Bill Bailey doing a West Country accent.
You were deep down with the others. You were there, and something went wrong. I dragged him out.
It's like a bloody cider festival!
Anyway, I think I've covered enough ground here. Like I said, I'm not the person to give an impartial review of this game because I really like the guys who made it and they're good friends of mine, so me giving a recommendation of this game is kind of like having your brother-in-law do your plumbing. He might be shit at it, he might not, but you'll still let him have a go at it because, well, he's a nice dude and he is banging your sister, so he must be good for something. I'll just say that I had a good time with Hobbs Barrow. It has a couple of minor flaws, but none that ruined my experience with it, and I was sufficiently engrossed in the story the whole time without wanting to reach for a walkthrough to keep me going to the next bit, even when I got stuck, which didn't happen very often. Even when it threw that Greek alphabet puzzle at me, I was like, okay, I'll just Google the Greek alphabet instead of Googling for the puzzle solution, so that's a testament to how much the game had my rapt attention throughout. So, yeah, well, take that how you will. I am, of course, looking forward to what the Cloak and Dagger lads will be doing next, and I'm very happy to see that they're finally getting the recognition they deserve with this game. So good on you, gents. I look forward to hanging out with you the next time we're in close physical proximity, and until that happens, I'll see you around the Chrono Stream. Ta!